She owns the company, but I run it. Situations like this have to come to a head before it resolves itself. It's about to come to a head.
How do you know?
Because I'm about to take it there. I'm definitely going to have to start drinking again.
The ground doesn't lie in West Texas. It either bleeds black gold or it swallows you whole. There is no middle ground, no mercy, no second chances. And Tommy Norris, a man who had spent his whole life fixing other people's messes on rigs that could crush a man without blinking, was about to find out just how deep the desert could bury a dream. He had a name, he had a reputation. He had the kind of hands that knew hard work the way most men know breathing. But the moment Cammy Miller looked him dead in the eye and fired him from CTT Oil like he was nothing, like all those years meant nothing, something shifted in Tommy Norris. Something hard and permanent. A man with nothing left to lose is either the most dangerous man in the room or the most desperate. Tommy was about to be both. He wasn't going to crawl. He wasn't going to beg. He was going to build. He was going to drill. He was going to bleed, if he had to. And God help anyone who got in his way, because CTT Oil was coming, named for Tommy, his son Cooper, and his father TL, and it was going to rise or burn trying. What nobody told Tommy, what nobody could have prepared him for, was that building an empire in West Texas doesn't just cost money. It costs loyalty. It costs blood. It costs pieces of your soul you didn't even know you were putting on the table. And before this was over, every single person Tommy Norris loved was going to pay a price. This is the story of that price. This is the rise of CTT Oil. This is the war for West Texas. And it started the day Tommy shook the wrong hand. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the Permian Basin right before everything goes wrong. It is not a peaceful silence. It is not the quiet of a Sunday morning or the stillness of a lake at dawn. It is the silence of a held breath, the silence of the desert watching you, waiting. And Tommy Norris had learned after decades on the rigs that when the desert went that quiet, something was about to break open. He just didn't know, on the day Cammy Miller fired him, that the thing breaking open was going to be his entire life. Cammy Miller ran CTT Oil the way a cold blade runs through warm flesh, clean, efficient, and without a single moment of hesitation. She was the kind of boss who smiled at you while she was ending you. And when she told Tommy his services were no longer required, she didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable about it. She just looked through him, like he was already gone, like he had never mattered at all. And maybe to her he hadn't. Tommy had given CTT years of his life, years of 14-hour days, of solving problems that would have driven lesser men to their knees, of making the company money it couldn't have made without him. And this is what it bought him. A cold office, a colder stare, and a door closing behind him, like a period at the end of a sentence nobody asked him to write. But here is the thing about Tommy Norris that Cammy Miller miscalculated. She thought firing him would break him. She thought sending him out into the West Texas heat with nothing but his pride and his calloused hands would grind him down. What she did instead was light a fire under a man who had been sitting on a powder keg his whole life without knowing it. Because the day Tommy Norris walked out of that office, he didn't go home to feel sorry for himself. He went home to build something of his own, something nobody could fire him from, because he was going to own every inch of it. CTT Oil, named for Cooper, Tommy, and TL. His son, himself, his father. 3 generations of grit tied up in 4 letters and a dream that the West Texas dust hadn't managed to kill yet. His son Cooper came in hot, the way young men do when they haven't yet learned how many times the world can knock you flat. Cooper had his own scars from roughneck work. The kind of physical damage that gets into your joints and doesn't leave, but he wore them like medals. He was fierce and hungry, and ready in a way that made Tommy's chest tight with something that lived between pride and fear. "Dad, this is our chance," Cooper had said, wiping sweat from his brow as they stood on their first patch of land, looking out at ground that might be worth a fortune or might be worth nothing. And Tommy had looked at his son's face, young, burning, certain, and thought, "I cannot let this boy down. Not again. Not after everything." TL, Tommy's father, was a different story. He was a man carved from the same West Texas stone as the landscape itself, all angles and weight, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised. He had been in the oil game long enough to have lost everything once: his wife, his health, his faith, and clawed his way back with nothing but stubbornness and whiskey and a refusal to die on somebody else's terms. He brought wisdom to CTT, the kind you only get from catastrophic failure. But he brought ghosts too. Old warnings, old wounds. "Boy, you dance with devils," he told Tommy one night in the makeshift trailer that served as their office, the wind screaming outside. "You end up in hell." Tommy heard him, He just didn't stop dancing, because Tommy had already made a deal he couldn't unmake. To get the rigs rolling, to get CTT off the ground with any kind of speed, he had reached out to Galeno. And Galeno was not the kind of man you reached out to casually. He was a cartel kingpin who wore tailored suits and spoke in a voice so smooth it could slide right under your skin before you realized it was a blade. He shook Tommy's hand with a smile that never quite reached his eyes and said quiet and certain, "You fail me, Norris, and I take what you love most." Tommy shook it off. He told himself it was just business. He told himself he was in control. He told himself a lot of things in those early days that the desert would eventually strip away one by one until nothing was left but the naked, ugly truth. The pact was made, the machine was in motion. And somewhere beneath the cracked West Texas soil, the first dark roots of CTT Oil began to grow, fed by desperation and dirty money and the kind of hope that doesn't know when to quit. The land they drilled on was not kind. The locals whispered that it was cursed. And in the oil patch, people don't whisper about curses lightly. Old wells had poisoned the soil, leaving the ground saturated with decades of chemical damage and bad memory. Rival drillers from MTech, Cammy Miller's people, lurked at the edges of the CTT operation like wolves circling a wounded animal, watching for the moment to move in. And they didn't wait long. In the dead of night they came, sabotaging lines, cutting what could be cut, breaking what could be broken. Because in West Texas, when someone threatens to take your market share, you don't send a letter. You send goons with wire cutters and a message written in damage. The valve explosion came without warning. One morning, loud as a cannon shot, it blew, sending a column of fire roaring skyward that could be seen for miles. Cooper was close, too close. He barely made it out, his hands blistered raw, his face marked by heat, his trust in the universe freshly shaken. Tommy arrived at the wreckage with his jaw set and his heart hammering, and the terrible quiet certainty of a man who understands that war has been formally declared. Was it an accident? Or had Cammy Miller ordered her people to burn CTT the ground before it ever got started? The answer didn't really matter. What mattered was that the message had been received, and Tommy Norris was the kind of man who answered messages. He secured a big lease from a desperate rancher, a deal that came together almost too smoothly, too cleanly, the kind of deal that leaves a taste in your mouth like metal. TL looked at the terms and said nothing, which was its own kind of warning. But the lease was real, and the land was real, and the oil beneath it was real, and CTT needed winds more than it needed caution right now. That night, as the wind howled through the derricks like a living thing, headlights cut through the dark. A black SUV rolling slow and deliberate into the CTT yard. Galeno's men, not here for a social visit, here because the boss wanted his cut early, and patience was not a virtue. The cartel practiced. "Boss says hello," one of them growled, and put a fist through a window just to make sure the greeting landed with the right weight. Tommy stood his ground. He always stood his ground. It was maybe his greatest quality, and definitely his most dangerous one. But standing his ground against men who answered to Galeno was a different calculation than standing his ground against corporate rivals or equipment failures. These men didn't argue, they didn't negotiate, they demonstrated. And as Tommy watched their taillights disappear into the West Texas dark, the fear he wouldn't admit to in daylight was gnawing at him in the silence they left behind. What if they stopped coming for him? What if they started coming for Cooper? For Angela? For Rebecca? Angela, his ex-wife, the woman who knew him better than anyone alive and still couldn't quite let go, was hovering at the edges of this new world Tommy was building, torn between the pull of old love and the clear-eyed knowledge of what following Tommy Norris into battle had cost her before. She had watched him risk everything once. She had paid the price for that alongside him. And now here he was again. Bigger gamble, higher stakes, same burning certainty in his eyes that always made it impossible to say no to him, even when every sane instinct said run. Their daughter Rebecca was back in town, sharp and ambitious, hungry to be part of something real, and that worried Angela more than anything. Because Rebecca had her father's fire, the kind of fire that doesn't stop to count the cost until the bill comes due. Angela begged her to stay away from the CTT site. "Your father's playing with fire," she said, and she didn't mean it metaphorically. But Rebecca was a Norris, and Norrises don't stay away from fires. They walked toward them. She slipped out to the site, started helping Cooper map the drills, and somewhere in the sweat and the work and the shared danger, the two of them built something, a bond, a spark in the chaos, the kind of connection that only forms between people who are standing side by side in the middle of something that could kill them. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying, and it meant one more person Tommy loved was now inside the blast radius of everything that was coming. The first oil flowed black and thick and beautiful, and for one shining moment CTT felt like a miracle. The crew cheered. Cooper laughed, really laughed for the first time in weeks, the sound of it cutting through the diesel haze like something clean. Tommy watched the black gold rise and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Real pride, not the wounded, stubborn kind that had been keeping him moving since Cammy fired him, but the deep, warm kind that settles into a man's bones when he has built something real with his own hands, and the hands of people he loves. He let himself have the moment. He deserved it. The desert was going to take it away soon enough. Dale Bradley showed up with a face like a man delivering a death notice. Dale was Tommy's oldest ally from the rig days, the kind of friend forged in situations where the wrong move kills you and the right move only hurts. He had bailed Tommy out of more bad spots than either of them could count, and Tommy trusted him the way you trust a man who has literally pulled you from burning wreckage. M-Tex is buying up judges, Dale said, not wasting time on softening the blow. They're coming for your lease. And just like that, the celebration was over. The triumph had lasted maybe 48 hours. West Texas had a sense of humor like that. Paranoia crept in the way it does in a siege, slowly, then all at once. Phones felt tapped, trucks seemed to be followed. Tommy stopped sleeping properly, lying in the dark, listening to the wind, running threat scenarios in his mind like a machine that couldn't shut down. Galino's threat replaying on a loop. Cammy's cold eyes, the sound of that window breaking, and then Cooper vanished. It happened on a regular Tuesday, which is somehow the worst kind of day for a catastrophe, ordinary and unsuspecting, and then suddenly destroyed. Hours stretched into agony. Tommy raced through rain-slicked roads with his heart slamming against his ribs, calling numbers that didn't answer, trying not to think the worst while thinking nothing but the worst. He found Cooper beaten badly, dumped by the roadside like trash, alive but barely. They said back off. Cooper gasped through split lips. Who? The cartel? Memtech? Someone else? Someone closer? TL uncovered the leak not long after. Someone inside CTT was feeding information to the enemy, plans, schedules, locations, all of it being passed to people who wanted CTT dead. The betrayal landed like a physical blow, because CTT wasn't a corporation. It wasn't some faceless business. It was family. It was people Tommy had looked in the eye and trusted. People who ate at the same table and worked the same ground and were supposed to be building something together. The suspicion that spread through the camp after TL's discovery was worse in some ways than any external threat. It poisoned every look, every conversation, every moment of silence. Angela confronted Tommy with her arms crossed and her eyes wet and her voice raw. End this before it kills us all. And Tommy looked at her and felt the truth of what she was saying pressing against him from all sides, and still he couldn't stop. Because CTT was his legacy. It was the only answer he had left to the question Cammy Miller had asked when she fired him, the question of what he was worth. One night, a figure approached the trailer with a gun in hand, and Tommy grabbed his shotgun and pressed himself against the wall, with his breath held and the wild beating of his heart, the only sound in the room. Was this it? Was this the end they had been building toward since the day he shook Galino's hand? The moment stretched like wire pulled too tight, and in that suspended second, Tommy Norris understood something he had been avoiding since the beginning, that he had not just built a company, he had built a target, and everyone he loved was standing inside it. Rebecca Norris did not wait to be rescued. That was never going to be her story. While her father was playing defense, she went on offense, slipping into the M-Tech offices after hours with an old key card she'd kept from years ago, moving through the dark corridors with her heart hammering and her phone ready, and the particular focused calm that comes over a person who has decided that fear is something to feel later. What she found on Cammy Miller's desk was the kind of ugly that doesn't surprise you when you already know who you're dealing with, but still lands heavy. Falsified environmental reports, bribes to regulators, and a clear documented plan to flood the market with cheap oil and drive small operations like CTT into bankruptcy. Not because Cammy needed to, because she wanted to. Because crushing people was something Cammy Miller did the way most people breathe without thinking and without stopping. Rebecca photographed everything, crept back out into the cold night with the security guard's radio crackling somewhere close and her breath fogging the air and two dead legs that she willed to keep moving. She made it home, the photos made it to Angela's phone, and Angela held the screen with shaking hands and said, "This is evidence. We take it to the authorities. We end this." And Tommy shook his head, and in the gesture was the whole weight of West Texas and cartel money, and bought cops, and a system so thoroughly corrupted it barely remembered what clean looked like. Cops are bought. Galino owns half the county. We use it ourselves, he called Dale. Trusted, reliable, ancient Dale. They met at an abandoned rig site under a sky the color of old blood. Dale brought news about Cammie's new partner, Eastern Money. Shadowy and significant, and told Tommy that the reason everyone wanted the CTT lease so badly was because it sat on the biggest untapped play in years. Of course it did. But Galeno was not done with Tommy. He never was. He summoned Tommy to a private airstrip where a sleek jet idled with its engines whining, and Galeno stepped out in a tailored suit with a cigar burning and the smile of a man who has never once in his life felt outmatched. "You owe me transport," he said calmly. "Refuse again, and your son won't wake up next time." Tommy stood there with the weight of his shotgun in the truck, and the full knowledge that it was useless here, and nodded once, hating every atom of himself for doing it. That night he drove an unmarked rig through back roads in the dark with Cartel cargo in the back, and every shadow a potential ending, and delivered it, and took the thick envelope of cash with hands that didn't quite stop shaking, and drove home with the money sitting on the seat beside him like an accusation. Blood money, but also survival money, also CTT money. The lines had stopped being clean a long time ago. Word spread through the oil patch that CTT was drilling like a machine possessed. 3 wells hitting pay in a single week. Roughnecks whispered about the Norris luck, but luck had a price, and it always came to collect. A young driller named Rico didn't show up for his shift one morning. They found his truck overturned in a ravine. No body, just blood on the seat. The sheriff called it an accident, with the bored efficiency of a man who has been told what to say. Tommy gathered his crew at dawn and said, "Anyone scared, walk now." Nobody walked. Loyalty or fear, it didn't matter. They were all the way in, and they all knew it. Cammie Miller, watching from her glass office, decided that enough was enough and called her fixer. "Make it hurt," she said. No traces. The fire at CTT's main pump station started that night. It roared 2 stories high and choked the stars with black smoke, and by the time the fire crews arrived late, suspiciously late, half the equipment was destroyed. Tommy arrived at the dying blaze with Cooper limping beside him, still bandaged from the beating, and they stood in the orange light and the heat and the smell of burning machinery, and Cooper said, voice gone hard and flat, "We rebuild." Tommy nodded, but something had cracked inside him that the nodding couldn't fix. How many more fires before everything burned for good? TL found him at the wreckage and asked the question that had been building since the beginning. Family or fortune? And Tommy looked at the twisted metal and said, "I choose both." TL snorted, "Ain't no both. Not here."